But I think from Henry's point of view, this was his last chance saloon. He had one chance. He
Mm.
might as well die if he didn't get it. Whereas Richard could, as you say, have gone away and come again. But for Henry, he wasn't going to get another chance. He
No.
had that moment.
Hello. On the 22nd of August 1485, Henry Tudor met Richard III at Bosworth Field. In a strange battle, Henry's smaller force eventually overcame Richard's army. The Wars of the Roses were all but over, after 30 years of murder, warfare and political machinations. In this final episode of our 6-part special, Derek Birks, author of The Guide to the Wars of the Roses, and David Pilling, author of Kingbreaker, joined to discuss the battle, the factions involved, Henry Tudor and Richard III. Coming up, we discuss Henry III and the Montfortians, Operation Sea Lion, Trent Park, and the North African campaign during World War II. So please do share with friends and family, but in the meantime, it's me, with Derek and David, on the Battle of Bosworth Field. If we try and remove this crime, was he actually a good king over the 2 years that he did reign? Because I think I'd read an article where he had carried out legal reforms that apparently were very important and significant.
Personally, I think that isn't the case. He's. They say that he set up trial by jury, that he banned forced loans by the crown. Um, well, he actually made forced loans himself later on, and it's always seemed to me you can't be a really good king for 18 months or 2 years. It just doesn't stack up. You can't have a legacy from that sort of period of time. Whether he would have been a good king over time, I'm not sure he wouldn't have been actually. He may well have been. But to judge him on that period of time is like, if you judged Edward the Fourth on any 2 years of his reign, or if you judge Henry the Fifth on any 2 years of his reign, and it wasn't 1415 or whatever, then, you're hard pressed to form a conclusion about whether someone was a good king or not.
Didn't he lift restrictions on printing rights? But he enabled more books to be printed in English.
Yeah, Edward the
Yeah.
Fourth had really kicked that ball off because Rivers was a patron of Caxton,
Yeah.
and he was very much in the forefront at Edward's court of promoting printing as a way of life, really, rather than illuminated writing. So again, Richard possessed many beautiful books, and I'm sure he did support that campaign, but I think it was a campaign that he didn't actually instigate. Well, I'm
And
sure he didn't instigate it, but
yeah, and this is my brief reading of a couple of paragraphs of Richard's reign. There's an argument in his favour that he set up something called the Court of Appeals, which
yes.
was meant to allow poor people to have greater access to justice. I wasn't so convinced of that because, I normally look at the 13th century, and that had been in motion for long before the Wars of the Roses period. And
Yes.
then all different historians are not convinced that Richard actually founded this particular court. There's evidence of it back in Edward IV's time or Henry VI's time.
Yeah.
It does seem quite vague. We're trying to give Richard the credit for all these progressive laws in a space of, what is it, 2 years he was king? It does seem a bit, unless he rushed it all through this great sort of stream of legislation in his one and only parliament, it seems going a bit too far in his favour.
Richard wanted to be seen, again, rather like his father. He wanted to be seen as a just man. He wanted to be seen as eventually as a great king. He wanted people to think that, he was the moral high ground compared to the licentious court of Edward the Fourth, his brother. So all of this, I think, was a means. I'm not saying it was done in any sort of unreal way, but it's all evidence of his attempt to win people over. which he was desperate to do.
Mm.
You mentioned his first part, his 1484 Parliament, which was after the first revolt against him, where there were over 100 people were attainted there, and that's a lot for this period, really. And so he had to try and get some traction in his favour.
Yeah.
I think that's part of it. But
Okay.
again, it would be unfair to judge him by dismissing those things equally, because there's not enough time really to
No.
make any sort of judgment. And that's why supporters of Richard will say, well, he ruled the north with justice, and he did, but that's not the same as being king.
Yes. Well, I think everything you've said, Derek, on Richard III has been entirely sensible.
I try to be sensible. That doesn't mean everyone agrees with me.
No. Right. Well, I think we should push on through till 1485 August, the Battle of Bosworth, which I think Battle of Bosworth Field, which I would say after Hastings is probably the next most significant battle in, I'm tempted to say world history,
I think that might be
but
a
certainly
stretch.
English medieval history. And it's for us when we go from the medieval period into the modern period. And I think we basically shift the rest of the world over to the modern period as well, don't we?
Yeah, I'm going to stop you there. I think, if you're in the 13th century, I think you're probably going to say the Battle of Evesham is one of the more important ones, or others. Within its time frame, Bosworth was clearly very, very important, but I'm not sure its significance is any greater than that, because if Henry Tudor had turned out to be a complete twerp, then the Bosworth would not have been the end of it.
Yes,
So,
we're making too much of one dynasty taking over from another. The Tudors.
I think, but the Plantagenets have been in charge for 300 years, more or less. So, and Bosworth, does mark the end of them effectively. So I think it's significant.
But I mean, as a keen historian of the Montfortians, you would argue Evesham is significant as well, then?
Oh yes, but of course the Plantagenets win at Evesham.
Yeah.
So yeah, they
Well,
lost at Bosworth, and of course they could have staged a comeback if Henry had lost at Stoke a couple of years later and so forth, but they didn't. And Bosworth.
of course, Henry Tudor was a Plantagenet as well.
Yes, but he didn't call himself that, did he?
No, he didn't call himself that. But
okay. So who was Henry Tudor, Derek?
Oh, the hard ones first. Okay.
Oh, is it?
No,
hard?
it's an easy one. Okay. So, Henry was the son of Margaret Beaufort. Margaret Beaufort was descended from John of Gaunt, and there was an illegitimacy to that line of descent. Although they were later legitimised, there were still some question marks about whether somebody from that line could inherit the throne. Henry was Earl of Richmond in theory. His claim was so slight during Edward's reign that although he was in exile because he was a Lancastrian, if you like, nobody really thought that Henry Tudor would ever be a potential king. Edward had two healthy sons, and even Margaret Beaufort, his mother, she wasn't arguing for Henry to be king in the 1470s and 80s. She was arguing for him to come home. She was negotiating with Edward IV to get him home and to take up his earldom and so on. And there's every evidence that she was continuing that discussion with Richard III. So at this point in time, there is no sense that Henry Tudor is a king in waiting. He's a sort of a Lancastrian also ran, exiled in Brittany.
Because Richard, as you mentioned, there was one rebellion. He suffers a few rebellions in his reign, doesn't he? Is Buckingham's one, or is that the one that you...
Well, that's the rebellion which goes under the name of Buckingham. That's another joke. it is a rebellion that covers a lot of the south of England, various patches of rebellion. And often what happens when you have patches of rebellion is that unless they're coordinated, they're all miserable failures. And that's what happened, basically. That was in the autumn of 1483. And Buckingham decided to desert Richard, which was a bold move, considering that Richard was the only person that had ever shown the slightest interest in him, and only person in power anyway. So yeah, he betrayed Richard, and yeah, he got into all sorts of trouble and was eventually executed. But yeah, that was the main rebellion against him. He didn't really suffer any other rebellions after that because everybody who was working against him was basically abroad, or most of them. A lot of people who had served Edward IV in the counties and at court had legged it to Brittany to join Henry Tudor. So you have the irony of this Lancastrian, most of whom supporters abroad are Yorkist, which has always amused me a bit. But it does, of course, lead to a very important promise that he makes to sweeten the pill for the Yorkists who end up supporting a Lancastrian, is that he promises to marry Edward IV's daughter, Elizabeth of York. And he doesn't just promise in a sort of, oh, by the way, I'll do this. He does it in a cathedral. He swears that he will do it. So it has some sort of binding power.
Was it just his lineage, or was it the fact that he was a sort of strapping, successful, great
last
example
man
of
standing? He was the last man standing.
Yeah, and it wasn't just disaffected Yorkists. People like the Earl of Oxford, John de Vere, who managed to escape from prison and get to Henry. He was the only. There's no one else. Everyone else is dead.
Yeah.
And Henry himself, I'd imagine at this stage, was he about 27, 28? Apparently he was quite sort of physically good looking, very intelligent, obviously. Whether he convinced everyone as a sort of, this is the guy who's going to lead a successful invasion of England and kill Richard, I don't know. I think it's all very desperate on the part of the people who are supporting him. This is really like a last throw of the dice, and let's hope this guy doesn't turn out to be a complete booby.
One of the things I always point out on this is that you've got a king, Richard III, brother of Edward IV, safe pair of hands, really, in terms of ruling a kingdom. But you decide as a local person in Sussex or whatever that you're not going to go with that. You're going to put your eggs in the basket of Henry Tudor, about whom you know absolutely nothing at all. He could be the village idiot as far as you're concerned.
Yeah.
You don't know. But despite that, you're going to go for him rather than Richard. And that speaks volumes for me.
And do you think that was triggered by like what people thought he had done to the princes, and that they regard him as a usurper?
I don't think it was just that. I think that there was a significant reaction at court to what happened to Hastings. And what happens at court filters through to the counties. People write letters, and opinion kind of formulates. It doesn't happen in any sort of organized way. But I think people felt, well, something is not right at court. And added to that, the disappearance of the princes, as you said earlier, the unexplained disappearance of the princes. And people just felt, well, no, the legacy of Edward IV is his two sons. If it's not them, it can't be Richard because of the things he's done. And
yes.
I get that.
That implies they did have standards then. I mean, it's not.
Well, there must have been a religious
completely
element to
ruthless and.
Yeah, there must be. Priests must be taking a position on this if it's sort of widespread amongst the kingdom. Is there a religious element to it?
No, I'm not sure there was, because I think enough priests sort of supported Richard's regime because that was where they were at the time. I mean, for every what you've also got to imagine that is for every one of these Yorkist supporters, mostly gentlemen and knights, for everyone that actually gave up everything, because these were the haves, not the have-nots. They weren't desperate men who had nothing. They had everything. That for every one of those that went abroad to support Henry, there must have been quite a few who said, "No, I don't think I'm going to do that, but I'm still very suspicious about Richard." And so what you've got then is a population of powerful men that includes many who are doubtful about Richard. And that will come home to roost in 1485.
Hello, Ollie here. Please forgive my interruption, but I wanted to let you know that at Aspects of History, we produce a digital magazine featuring articles, interviews, short stories, and book reviews of the best historical writing available. Authors featured including Ben Macintyre, Lucy Worsley, Andrew Roberts, and plenty more. An annual subscription is available for only $9.99. That's pounds or dollars. Yep, you heard that right. That's 6 issues for under £10 or dollars. Head over to aspectsofhistory.com to subscribe, where you can also gift subscriptions. Now back to the show. Okay, so the battle. What do we need to know about the battle? I mean, we know the victor, but this is, you're sort of slightly doubting its significance.
No,
Derek.
no, I'm not doubting its significance. I'm just saying we can't go overboard on the significance
why
of that
not?
one battle.
Why not, Derek?
Well, because, as David said earlier, I think if Henry had lost at the Battle of Stoke a couple of years later, then we wouldn't be talking about Bosworth. So it's all relative to what happens afterwards. If at the time, and I've said this many times, if you ask somebody in September 1485 whether that was it, whether that was the end of all the fighting, if you ask the average nobleman and gentleman, I think they'd be saying, well, let's wait and see. Because so much had changed and happened over the years, I don't think anybody would be saying, yeah, it's all sorted. And so I don't think we should either.
Is it Shakespeare that makes us think this then?
Shakespeare makes us think. It doesn't make us think anything, but people tend to read things from Shakespeare because it's sort of very well known. No, it's a very important battle, but it's also probably the oddest battle that in the Middle Ages.
So why is it
weird
odd?
Battle. Well, you've got a small army and a massive army, in theory, and the small army wins. That's odd to start with.
And they had to attack uphill as well.
Yeah.
Richard had he had artillery, he had all the advantages. And Richard is touted by his fans as this great military commander. It's like he leads in one battle, he loses, he gets killed. Sorry, that's not Henry V, is it?
No. Played one, lost
one.
But it's also odd because arguably the two largest armies in the field, allegedly on the king's side, didn't fight at all. The army of Thomas Stanley didn't fight at all to speak of, and the army of the Earl of Northumberland, which was bigger than anybody else's, probably 10,000 strong, they didn't fight at all either. And that's a lot of muscle that's not coming in on the side of the king. So it's a very odd battle, very strange.
Yeah, I think one of the key moments is that Richard orders Northumberland forward because the Yorkist vanguard under Norfolk is getting beaten by Oxford, and Northumberland doesn't move, he just stays there. And there's this sort of argument is that, well, he couldn't move because his men were positioned so awkwardly, in which case Richard had really stuffed up his deployment then, hadn't he? Or Northumberland just decided to not do anything and let things pan out.
Well, Northumberland was slow to start with, wasn't he?
Yeah.
But then that classic thing where the citizens of York write to Richard and say, what are the plans for mustering then? And he said, what do you mean, what are the plans? Hasn't Northumberland already sent out the summons to array and all the rest of it? But no, he hadn't. He was in no hurry to go anywhere and fight a battle.
And doesn't the city of York, there's this idea that the people in the north, and York in particular, loved Richard. And they send 400 men to fight at Bosworth, and they move so slowly, they didn't get there until about 2 days afterwards. Like, I imagine them stopping at every pub along the way. They go, oh, we love Richard, gotta save Richard. Oh dear.
The problem these days is we are, as a society, so divorced from this sort of military combat that we tend to think of it as if, oh yeah, it's just a battle. if you're one of the people who's going to take part in that battle and you don't feel up to it, then you're not going to go very fast to get there.
No, especially because things have got so brutal in the past 30 years. Like the penalties for losing are, if you're a gentleman, you'll be attainted, you'll probably be killed unless you can run away.
Yeah.
The commons are just slaughtered en masse. So yeah, you're going to think twice before committing to anything.
And if you look at Northumberland's own position, his father had died fighting for Henry VI. He was imprisoned early on by Edward IV, eventually managed to get his earldom back. Is he going to risk much for Richard, Duke of Gloucester, as was, who he regarded as somebody who'd really usurped his position of authority in the north anyway? So is he going to commit to Richard? Well, he might do. Let's see how things pan out. And they didn't pan out very well for Richard.
No. I think it's worth pointing out that Richard could have got away. The Spanish ambassador who was present, he actually said to him, "Look, this is going really badly. Why don't you get off the field, and we'll come back and have another go." You know, because Edward IV, who was this great commander, he, you know, showed his back a couple of times and then came back from the Low Countries and managed to recover. So Richard wasn't doomed. He chose to embark upon this famous last charge.
But that's the difference between the two brothers. That, and I've said it untold number of times, but that's what Richard, Duke of York, would have done. He'd have stayed and fought, and so did Gloucester. But Edward was wilier than that. Edward was sensible, canny. And so if he thought he couldn't win, why would you carry on? Because you lose everything. So you're right to point that out. He could have just gone and maybe gathered his forces again and made another bid for the throne. After all, who was Henry Tudor? Nobody knew, as we've said, anything about him. So he might be a complete failure. But he didn't.
No.
As many listeners may be aware, that Richard's body was found in the car park in Leicester, which I have to say, after all this discussion, seems a much more appropriate place for him to be lying in rest rather than in Leicester Cathedral. But he had 11, I think, is it 11 wounds on him? So sort of hacked to death.
I think most of the wounds were to the head, but you'll know better than me.
Well, I don't necessarily, but I think a lot of those wounds would also have been post-mortem, I think. I think he charges straight at Henry. That's his plan. Plan C is to charge straight at Henry, because he knows if he kills Henry, it's all over. Although interestingly, there are other scenarios to that. But so he tries to kill him. He gets very close. So this is the thin boundaries of events, isn't it? He gets very close. He gets close enough to kill his standard bearer, who is never going to be far from the monarch. So he gets very close.
I've got a letter that I've been sitting on for a couple of years now. I've been trying to get translated, but it's very difficult handwriting. But it's written by one of Henry Tudor's French mercenaries, a chap called Nicholas Le Boeuf, Nicholas the Beef. But he was actually present. He was fighting as part of Henry's bodyguard when Richard closed in. And he actually describes in this letter what happened. This is an eyewitness account. And he says that Henry got off his horse and he got in among us, among the pikes, because he wanted to stand with us against Richard's charge. So the idea that there's this idea that Henry was a coward who hid, or, you know, just kind of cowered before the mighty Richard. In fact, he could have if he's a coward, he could have turned around on his horse and rode off. But according to this contemporary eyewitness account, Henry actually gets off his horse and prepares to stand among his French and Swiss mercenaries. And he's like, if we're going to die, I'm going to die here with you. So it's a lot of bravery on the sides of both leaders, I think, even though Henry had no military experience.
But I think from Henry's point of view, this was his last chance saloon. He had one chance. He might as well die if he didn't get it. Whereas Richard could, as you say, have gone away and come again. But for Henry, he wasn't going to get another chance. He had that moment. The
option for even if he escapes the battle is he's going to spend the rest of his life as some sort of penniless exile. He's quite sort of pathetic Bonnie Prince Charlie figure.
Yeah.
You know, so screw
he's
that.
been there before.
Yeah, I've done that. I don't like it. Well,
But we should probably mention the pivotal moment of the battle, which is when that charge is taking place. Um, the people we haven't mentioned so far are very much are the Stanley brothers, Thomas Stanley and William Stanley. Now, Thomas Stanley and William Stanley are committed to Henry. They have promised Henry they will fight with him. But kind of like when the time is right, we'll fight with you as long as you don't get totally butchered in the first part of the battle. But Thomas Stanley's army's very sizable, several thousand certainly. His brother also has several thousand men, fewer than Thomas, but a substantial number of men. Now the difference is Thomas Stanley is keeping all options open. He wants to be able to say to Richard, if Richard wins, well, yes, I was guarding the road to London just in case, Henry escaped and so on. William Stanley does not have that option because William Stanley has already been outed to Richard as a traitor by Stanley's son. So when we get to Bosworth, as far as William Stanley is concerned, there has to be one victor, and it has to be Henry, because otherwise he's going to face treason charges. So when it comes to the crunch, and the Henry Tudor's waiting to see, are the Stanleys going to come in? Are they at the last minute? Are they going to save me? Thomas Stanley just sits there. But William Stanley decides he has to intervene in case Henry is killed. Now, people read all sorts of things into this. One thing I will say, there's absolutely no chance that William deliberately arrived just in the nick of time. I don't think he was planning it down to the last second, but effectively that's what happened. He intervened, and of course Richard's charge, whilst it had got a long way, it was sort of held up by this influx of men coming in from their flank. So that proved to be the significant moment.
I think we should also mention Oxford. Henry basically entrusts most of his soldiers to the Earl of Oxford, who the reason Richard is kind of provoked into this charge is because Oxford defeats the Yorkist vanguard. He comes up with these tactics where his men are in this very close formation, which seems to be like a continental style tactic that Richard's men aren't familiar with. And so this much sort of smaller army is able to fight on a much narrower front. And Richard is basically losing the battle before he decides to launch this charge. And that's down to John de Vere, the Earl of Oxford. He then goes on to win Henry's battles for him at Stoke and Blackheath as well.
Yeah, he's one of the foremost military officers and tacticians, I think, of his generation. But what I find completely delicious is the fact that he's fighting the Duke of Norfolk, John Howard, who leads the vanguard, the man who has taken his lands and estates in Norfolk, and who there is such a personal animosity there.
Well, I think they actually comes to single combat between them.
Probably.
They actually come together in the battle, and they're fighting. And Norfolk, I think, is about 20 years older than Oxford.
Yeah.
And his visor gets knocked off, and before Oxford can finish him off, an arrow goes into Norfolk's eye, and that kills him.
It's always an arrow, isn't it?
Always an arrow. Oxford must have been standing there going, "Oh."
But you're right. I mean, he had most of the men with him, which is why, as you say, to Richard, it was an attractive idea to charge down at Henry, because Henry only had a relatively small force with him.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So it could have worked. It's not an act of stupidity on Richard's part. It could have easily worked. He could have, he got very close to Henry. I suspect
it would have done without the intervention of William Stanley.
Yeah.
I think it would have done.
And if
fascinating. So it's a hugely dramatic battle, really.
Yeah.
Then.
Yeah. Very dramatic. Yeah.
And if Richard had knocked off Henry and killed him personally, that would have solved most of his problems, I think.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah.
Yes.
I mean, it was a very exciting battle, unless you were the Earl of Northumberland, because he was basically having tea.
I think we might have solved it. We've reached the end. Henry Tudor becomes Henry VII, and a new dynasty is born. and school children are force-fed the Tudors for the rest of
I know.
Although, as Derek said, you said earlier that Henry VII was essentially a Plantagenet. Well, his son, Henry VIII, is even more so. I mean, he's
Yes.
Edward IV's grandson, nephew.
Right. Yes.
He's Edward the
yes.
Fourth's grandson. 'Cause he's
Grandson, yes.
the
Yeah.
son of Elizabeth of York. Yeah. So,
And he's a spitting image of Edward IV.
yeah, he is.
You know, they're both big, blonde.
Yeah.
Shows the
Yeah.
power of rebrands, doesn't it?
Yeah, exactly.
Very much so with Henry VII. Yeah. It's all about branding.
Well,
Nothing's
look, this
new.
has been really quite wonderful and hugely eye-opening and epic. So, listeners, links are in the show notes for Derek's Guide to the Wars of the Roses and also David's Kingbreaker. And I'd be now what I wanted to do, and I'm so I suppose I'm asking you whilst we're recording to put you on the spot, but David, very keen to speak to you about the period of Edward I, Henry III, Edward I, and the de Montforts, Simon de Montfort. And Derek, Anne O'Brien's written very good books on the women of the Wars of the Roses.
Yeah.
So thinking it'd be great to have a chat about, Elizabeth Woodville, Anne Neville, and the others.
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. I think the women of the Middle Ages, well, there are people telling their story a bit more now, but they've been ignored for a long time. And my feeling is you ignore women at your peril. So yeah, that'd be great. Yeah.
I tend to find that every forceful, powerful male figure in this era that has a very similar wife, you tend to get power couples.
Yeah.
Edward I and Eleanor of Castile. Eleanor was she's even more frightening than her husband, I think.
That's not easy.
No, it's not. But Henry II, Eleanor of Aquitaine, etc.
Yeah.
Yes, absolutely. All right. Well, look, this has been great. Thank you. As I say, links in the show notes. But until next time, thank you, David. Thank you, Derek.
Thanks very much. Yeah.
Thanks so much for listening. Links are in the show notes. Please share with friends and family. And if you want to get in touch, you can through X or email history@aspectsofhistory.com. But until then, thank you and good night.